Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Keith Mitchell. I see a lot of faces over the past day or so that I recognize. I see quite a lot of faces that I don't recognize. So for those of you who don't know me, I led UKNOF, which was the predecessor organization to NetUK for its entire 18-year history. And the NetUK program committee were kind enough to ask me to come and tell you a little bit about what went down at UKNOF. So what am I going to talk about today? A little bit of backstory, how UKNOF came to be, and some of the principles behind it, its history, growth, successes, some of the sustainability challenges that you face when you're running a network operators group, and some lessons learned about what worked and what didn't work. You know, I think we've said a lot about community over the past day. I think I'd like to just say a few things about professional development and how that relates to community. And UKNOF is gone, but it's not forgotten. There are some things that we've left behind. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that this talk is in a personal capacity. This is just me. I'm not speaking for UKIF or UKNOF or any other organization that I am or have been affiliated with. So, as Steve said, I've been doing this a while. It's kind of weird after 4 decades to be looking back at my career from effectively the end of it. I was fortunate enough to be educated at 2 of the best computer science departments in UK universities, and then to work for 2 very innovative high-growth companies in my apprentice years in the late 80s. I then got involved in building the UK internet from scratch, and along the way we seem to have created some organizations that have subsequently become institutions. I was also quite involved in RIPE, in 2006, the kind of midpoint in my career, I moved to the States and I got more involved in the DNS side of things at ISC and OARC. And these days I'm mostly retired, or what some people call unretired. I'm still in the industry. I'm still trying to be useful and doing things for a few other organizations. If you're really interested in the full details, there's a link there. So what was the inspiration, the motivation for UKNOF? In the early noughties, it was very clear that the continent region organizations like NOG and RIPE were performing a very valuable role. And in Europe, at least, we were starting to see, per country, I think Switzerland and France were the first with national NOG groups. I decided that there was a need for an open forum. Although we had a lot of strong activity in the UK industry, a lot of it was based on closed membership organizations. And I felt that that was not in the spirit of the way the internet was founded by organizations like IETF or like RIPE and NIETF, where there's open participation when anyone can come along and join. It was very clear in the early noughties that there was a skills shortage, there was a training gap. I was also concerned that the UK ISP industry was far too centralized in London and the southeast. And to me, the principle of national infrastructure sovereignty was really important. I think only recently that some people are starting to wake up to that. So this seemed like a good idea to do around 2002. But I was working in the IXP startup space then. My employer did not have the resources to let me work on that. Around 2003, there were some energetic folks who created a UK NOG initiative, but it didn't really seem to get past beyond registering all the domains. But it did seem that if you had the same proportion of people of the population attending a UK national meeting as maybe a RIPE and NOG meeting, you could probably get a couple of hundred people on a regular basis. But it didn't take much business planning to figure out that this was never going to pay for anyone's livelihood. So I took a career break around 2004 and 5, finally got a chance to get UKNOF started. At the same time, there were some usual suspects in the industry who thought there was a need for an alternative ISP trade association, which they called UKIF. So they set up the usual kind of public benefit entity that UK industry used at that point. I decided that making UKNOF one of the 3 forums that comprised UKIF, its technical forum, would help with a lot of the critical mass and overhead issues. You know, another essential step that I could see from NANOG in particular was that we needed a program committee. But even when I was doing this, there was people who were being critical of why are you doing this? Why should you be doing this? So we come up with a charter. I think you'll see there's a lot of words in there, but some of the words are still very valid. Operational, keep it technically and engineering focused. Sharing knowledge, ideas, best practice, skills, infrastructure stability and security, and the idea of getting people together several times a year, and also the important principle of rotating these gatherings around the UK as well. So after much cat herding and banging together of heads, we got our first meeting in May 2005, not so far from here. The agenda looks pretty thin by modern standards, but I think you will see that there are more than a few people who were involved there who are still very much present and involved in the industry. And that formula worked pretty well. We did maybe 20 meetings. Things were pretty informal. We had a program committee, we had a board, we had some regular volunteers, pretty much did everything somewhat on a slightly ad hoc basis, but we steadily grew the registration over these 7 years. It was clear that we were feeling a need. Sometimes it didn't quite hang together. We had venues that were too small and had to run wait lists, so there was a last-minute technical scramble, or the venue had terrible food, or a sponsor bailed out at the last minute. But we did get to enjoy curries the night before the meeting, so that was pretty good, especially when I was living in the US by that point, and I was juggling this with a US resident day job. But as this progressed, it actually began to feel like a distinct community and not just the intersection of the existing communities in the UK industry, so that was nice. And like anything that's successful, we started to run into success disasters where it was clear that the model wasn't going to scale any further. But there were also some opportunities at the time. The non-UKNOF forums at UKIF had basically not really come to anything. I changed employment, which meant I could carve out some time for UKNOF. Dinesh became available initially to bring in sponsor money, but ultimately to run just about everything. So we made some changes. We co-opted some key volunteers onto the board. We created some additional committees to run things. The UKIF Limited legal entity was purely UKNOF at that point. And then we were in a much stronger position to run things professionally, pay for venues, platforms, other services to make it a more scalable organization. And that worked really well. If you look at the attendee graph there, you'll see that meetings 20 through 28, things steadily grew. I think the peak period was maybe about 28 through 39. UKNOF 33, one of the high points, we had 360 people in the room in 2016. We only beat that for one of our pandemic virtual meetings, just slightly. We had some interesting internet history presentations from some key players in the industry, some of whom are sadly no longer with us. Last time I checked, the presentation that had the most views in YouTube from the archives was Tim Robinson's talk at 34 about wireless ISP. Before things grew, another high point was when Brandon managed to get the BBC Broadcasting House Council chamber. We actually still fitted into that around 11. I think our most logistically complex meeting was 32 when we co-located with a peering forum in Sheffield. I think that was also the one where we had a very cool social at the Steam Museum nearby, a previous industrial revolution. But I think that the best break catering was probably the West Country cream tea breaks at Hewlett Packard in Bristol. And needless to say, much beer was also consumed. And yeah, we had a few face palms as well. There was the time when we were having a meeting in Reading and one of our volunteers got stuck in traffic, so the Ethernet switch for the meeting network didn't arrive until the very last minute, and it was rapidly taped to the front of the stage. And I think it was our second speaker was a large Scandinavian gentleman who stood on the stage flexed, the mains lead popped out the switch, and we lost power to all of the wireless access points. Football stadiums didn't work out too well as venues. I remember some entirely fried food at one, and another one there was, we ran the entire meeting off one consumer DSL connection. Our first meeting in Edinburgh was around 2010 when people started using smartphones for maps, and the maps were a lot more two-dimensional than Edinburgh was, so various people got lost. We learned a few things about shepherding and screening sponsors when we had a particularly cringe-worthy presentation. Again, I think this was in Sheffield from someone who was insisting that we monetize our side hustles. And then there was the meeting in Leeds where we had some not quite finished office space which had raised floor on it, and of course network engineers being network engineers, when we put the event network in, they just had to lift all the tiles and we'd half an hour to go before the start of the meeting and half the floor was still up. So anyway, that was all fun, but towards the end of the 20-teens, things started to get a little bit more difficult. I'm sorry to say I've worked in and with a bunch of countries, and I'm afraid the UK just seemed to have a rather stingy culture when it comes to spending money on training its IT staff. We were very well aware that many attendees, they were taking time off work, they were paying for their own travel, despite the fact this was benefiting their employers were not supporting them to participate. So we established fairly on the principle that it would be free to attend UKNOF meetings and they'd be entirely sponsor funded. But that funding started to get more difficult to get. And we tried various experiments with registration charging, diversifying income, but there was varying degree of success and popularity on that. So things were mostly still working, but it was getting harder. And particularly with the non-exciting part of running the organization, it was getting harder to find people to help with that. And then came the pandemic, and everything in life had to pivot to online, especially conferences. And the double challenge for the community there was not only could people not get to the conferences in person anymore, but these, the network operators were supporting this critical infrastructure that everyone's life was running on. So a place of community to do both coordination and also decompression became really important. So we took some steps in that. We started running shorter online-only events. We also set up a Mattermost-based chat platform. It was a lot of work, and at the same time, we weren't getting the same registration revenue from the meetings or the sponsorship, and that was burning our cash reserves. We all made it to the other side, but the recovery for the pandemic was tricky. It wasn't just for UKNOF, it was for a lot of other organizations in the space. I think we're kind of back there now, but certainly in the 2 or 3 years afterwards, the participation and attendance was just never quite the same. We did some hybrid meetings, but actually running a hybrid meeting is a lot more work than running either a in-person meeting or a fully online meeting, and that was draining people's energy and our resources even more. So eventually, everything ran out of steam. We wrapped up 52 in September 2023. If you really want to see the post-mortem all in detail, there was a presentation we gave at the end of start of 2024 about that. But I think, we had a good run. We still achieved a lot. 52 full meetings, another 6 virtual ones. The total registration across all the meetings was about 8,700 people. Nearly 700 speaker presentations, all of these are still available. We got to 25 different venues around 14 cities. We certainly managed to get through more than a few curries. What worked? I think something that is just as true now as it was then is, there's been some really good content over the past day, and having a program committee that is committed and engaged and proactive, goes out and seeks content, doesn't just let it get in, is key to having high quality content. We also established the principle of editorial and operational separation. So the business of running the meetings and bringing in the money was very separate from the process of submitting and approving content, and content which was sponsored content was clearly labeled as such, and we didn't just allow advertorial to come in. The online platforms worked out pretty well. Indico's open source, so it's imperfect, but it is kind of a soup to nuts workflow management for everything you need to do with conference content, so that was really good. The chat, having a sophisticated chat platform like Mattermost was really good during the meetings, and it was very active during the meetings, but in between, nobody can agree what chat platform to use, so that wasn't quite so successful. And I think another thing that was pretty successful was getting ahead of the step functions and scaling and not letting ourselves get bottlenecked because of change of environment. The free registration model worked until it didn't. I think as a community, everyone behaved very well. I believe that it was a community that was welcoming. I think that the regional engagement across the UK worked really well as well. There was definitely local business and university activities that got showcased that might not otherwise. There's certainly people who've become much more active in the national networking community, even if they started locally. Going back to the same venue each year and rotating these worked really well. It made a lot of things reproducible and scalable. And I'm not just speaking for myself. There was a bunch of British expats who were both our supporters in terms of supporting the meeting and also as acting a bridge between the UK and international communities. So what didn't work? Sometimes the donated venues, as I mentioned, weren't up to scratch. We failed to manage the migration to paid registration. Maybe we should have started lower earlier on that process. It's kind of hard to know what would have been exactly right there. Succession planning is hard. We didn't really manage to pass the torch of the leadership to another generation very well. And I was effectively leading 2 organizations at the same time for about a dozen years there. That's not as easy as you think it is. And sometimes if you're doing one as a side hustle, you finish up making shortcuts and doing things in ways that are perhaps not ideal. Also, running stuff like this, running events doesn't just require people building networks or webcasts. It also needs people to raise the money and to sit in the registration desk and to make sure that the bottom line is met. And that's harder to recruit volunteers from. On diversity, I think our attendee diversity was no worse than the rest of the industry, which is nothing special, I'm afraid. I don't know whether we made any progress with that or not. The board diversity was certainly less than the industry average, and I don't think we actually, despite trying, we didn't really succeed in fixing that. So, yeah, I mentioned some of the sustainability challenges already. I think one of the things I didn't mention is post-pandemic, it did seem like people had less energy and time to be involved in industry activities. And that wasn't just about UKNOF. I saw that in a number of other industries as well. Again, that seems to be coming back. Brexit didn't help us at all. It didn't help the UK economy, made it more difficult for people to attend. And it created barriers between the UK and the EU in terms of bringing in speakers and attendees. And the registration fees, it wasn't just about people couldn't afford it or couldn't get it reimbursed. There was also people who objected to it in principle. Yeah, I've mentioned most of the other points there already. So I've been doing this community building in the industry for several decades. I have a few observations about that. It takes years. I've seen people try to get internet exchanges up and running in 6 months and completely faceplant because there was no community to support it. I think that, like any human activity, there is philosophical and political differences. And I see people come to running internet nonprofits and membership organizations with roughly 2 approaches. There's a communitarian approach where you're building entirely on volunteering and in-kind donations, and you're effectively running your network operator group like a kibbutz. Or there's a more capitalistic approach where you're building upon bottom-line sustainability, accountability, and you're running your NOG like a small business. I have further observations about what kinds of people and their background fit into these 2 camps. But I'm an engineer by background, and I take a pragmatic approach. I think you need a balance of both of these. But we do not live in an age of centrism. If you're either for or against, and it's not much fun being stuck in the middle where people are disputing these things. So Anyway, we had a bit of a pragmatic bodge. It mostly worked until it didn't. We took a lightweight approach. The resource base was finite. We decided not to put our energy into popularity contests or governance process documents. And the board directors were co-opted rather than elected. And I don't know, perhaps if it had been more competitive to become a leader of UKNOF, then maybe we would have survived the succession situation better. But, it wasn't mostly about the politics of the governance. It was mostly about bringing people together and learning stuff. And I found it a lot of fun. We did over 50 meetings. I like to think that we made a difference. And if I tried to thank everybody that was involved at this point, it would be inadequate. I would definitely miss people out. It's a case of we were all a community. It was about thanking and being grateful for the community efforts. If there is one person I'm going to mention, it's Fergus Mackay, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. Fergus was a strong supporter of UKNOF from the very first day right through to the end, and he deserves recognition and gratitude and remembrance for that. So, I said I have some thoughts about community, and I think one of the key things that community does is it enables professional development, early personal development. We still have a very specialized niche industry. Your peers are amongst the best people to learn from. And the thing that has helped me throughout my career is not getting too sucked into this year's technology or this tweaky thing or accreditation, but it's more about the skills that are grounded in first principles, in theory, maths, algorithms, the soft skills of running organizations. These are the things that stand the test of time. Building your network, not just by doing the day job, but by volunteering for organizations like NOGs, nonprofit organizations in the space, getting engaged internationally. These are all really important things. Also think about diversifying your income. That side project or side hustle today might become your day job in the future. That's happened to me a few times. And as you progress through your career, don't just think about what you can do, but think about how you can enable and mentor and promote and teach others as well. And they're not the only place you can do this, but I would say that NOGs are a pretty perfect place to do a lot of this in our business. So, as I said, UKNOF is gone, but not forgotten. There is some legacy left behind. I think it's been a pleasure to see many people develop themselves and grow and develop their skills and their standing in the industry throughout the time. There's been a lot of knowledge sharing and education. There's been networks built, and it's a bit of a cliche, but I don't just mean that in terms of actual infrastructure, I also mean that in terms of interpersonal networks as well, and also that leading to friendships being made. One of the great things we were able to do was to bring speakers who had maybe spoken at an international event to come and repeat these talks to a UK audience, to people who might not otherwise be able to engage with them. And there's also been times where we've had talks that were at UKNOF that were like, this is really good, this is the best of British, let's invite the speaker to repeat it at an international meeting. I used to say that UKNOF was about distribution of clue. I believe much clue was distributed. And then, things didn't die completely. We were able to pass the baton on to Net London, Net Manchester, and here in NetUK as well, which is great to see. So what else remains of UKNOF? There are archives. There is a static copy of the UKNOF Indico site, which has all the presentation slide decks and information about the meetings. All of the talks that were videoed are available on the UKNOF YouTube channel. There's also an old-style static index into all of that. The public mailing lists have been preserved, but they need work done to them to be anonymized before they would be suitable for publishing as archives. All the non-public content has been taken offline. The PII has been deleted. I know that various people, some of whom are in this room, have made private scrapes of some of the above public content as well, so these archives are not just a single point of failure. It was certainly flagged up to Internet Archive that this material was worthy of preservation. Unfortunately, we've not really had much in the way of interest or support from UK institutional archive organisations, which is a bit unfortunate. But if there's anybody who would like to create additional mirrors of the above static content, that would be welcome. And at the moment, most of the archive stuff is being hosted at Felix, and I'm grateful to Marek Gazalski for providing that hosting. So hopefully this hasn't been too many ramblings of an old guy. If you think any of this internet history stuff is of interest, I have a few other presentations that I've given recently. From my point of view, I still think the most exciting time to work in this industry was the 1990s, and I have a couple more talks I'd like to give at some point if there's interest. And that's pretty much it. This slide's got a little bit of information about me, pointers to all these other presentations, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Keith, hello. Greg Choules, now ISC, then 3UK. My first was number 17 in Edinburgh. Just a couple of correction points. Sheffield, we went to Kelham Island Museum, where they have the River Don engine, which is the most powerful static steam engine in the world. York was where we went to the Rail Museum. And then when they kicked us out of their bar after we drunk them dry, we walked down the road to Akbar's and said, have you got a table for 30? They didn't bat an eyelid and just walked us straight in, and that was one of the best curries.
Yeah, good times.
Oh, hi Keith, Tim Chown, JISC. Yeah, I remember hosting a UKNOF in Southampton at the university I was at the time for about 30 people. Said to one of our security guys who was really good, hey, you're doing this really cool stuff, why don't you speak to these 30 people about it? And he did, and within 3 days he'd taken an offer from one of them to go somewhere else. But that was progression, that's good, it's about teaching and enabling. So I learned a lesson there. My question to you though, you've hinted at it a few times, is about basically UK internet history. I think UKNOF deserves its place in that. Where is this actually captured? Is there a place to go and read about UK internet history? Is there like a forum, a place? Where is that? Does it exist? Or is
where does UK internet history exist?
Well, where would you go to find out about it, read about it, discuss it?
Yeah, there are various history projects, but as far as I'm aware, none of them are UK specific. I've tried to gather resources. I think there was an initiative within Links at one point to do a Links history initiative. There's also the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge. I've expressed a little bit of interest in some of this, but yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's up to us to decide what is, to interpret how the last few decades have gone in terms of this internet thing being created from scratch, but I do think it is incumbent upon us to preserve the material so that future historians can actually decide what is or is not important.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of, is there a central resource for UK internet history? I do not believe that there is, and I think it would be a great project if that could be created.
Yeah, okay. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Tim.
Any more? Well, thank you very much, Keith.
Okay, thank you all.